Hello, my quilty friends. It's Stacy of Stacy Create Stuff, and this is a bonus video for the Haven Quilt-along. So if you aren't doing Haven or aren't interested in Haven, skip this video and watch one of my others instead. Maybe that one. And you may notice that I have a few of the painted desert blocks up on the design wall now, so that's very exciting. This bonus video is all about cutting out the fabrics for Haven. This video is meant more as a reference rather than probably watching from start to finish. And as such, there are timestamps in the description that you can zip through to whichever fabric it is that you are cutting. Now, I show all of the cutting on the Forest Lake colorway, which is the blue and teal here, but the same cutting instructions go with the painted desert. And the updated guides are available on my website. I did find a couple of little tiny errors, nothing that would throw you off. The original instructions have you cutting an extra strip of, I think, 2 colors, and they were narrow strips. Not a big deal. If you happen to have already cut, you're fine. You still have plenty of fabric and you got all your pieces out. And the other error is that in Flying Geese number 5, I mismarked the little wings to be, I think, navy or rust, and they should actually be teal 2 or salmon 2. But you would have cut the correct color. It's just colored wrong and marked wrong on the sheet. All of that is fixed now, and the updated guides are downloadable from my website. And if you are signing up for the Haven mailing list, which is the only way that you will get a weekly PDF of the block instruction, then you will automatically get the updated version starting now. If you've already downloaded one, you might want to go back. It will say REV1 as the last part of the file name. All right, without further ado, because this is a long video, let's get going. We're going to start with the Goldenrod, which is the fabric that is the pop of either color or contrast to the rest of the quilt. And we're just going to go through each of these instructions. And I highly recommend that you do them in order and you kind of check them off as you go. And it's a good idea to reference this video if you have any questions. Some of them are very straightforward. Cut strips, cut them into squares or rectangles, but some of them we have to cut a strip, cut some pieces, and then trim that strip down to a narrower width. Let's get going. To start with, we're going to cut one 5.5-inch strip. And of course, you can download your own free instruction sheet from my website. There is a link in the description below, and I'll also pop up a QR code that you can link to. So we'll start by squaring up the fabric, of course. And just as a note, when you are squaring up fabric, try to trim off the least amount that you can. I've had students in my classes before decide to trim off, and they trim off an excess amount. The least amount that you can, the better. And I'm aligning my ruler on the fold. So now that we've evened that up, we can cut that 5.5-inch strip. And if you are new to my channel, I am ambidextrous, so I can use the cutter in either hand. You may have to square up your fabric and then turn your fabric. That is perfectly fine. All right, we've cut the 5.5-inch strip. The next part of the instruction is to subcut into 4 5.5-inch squares. I'm just evening up the selvage end, and I'm going to go ahead and trim off the selvage. On batiks, they tend to print them right to the edge. I probably could just leave those on, but the fabric is woven ever so slightly differently right at the edge, so that's why I trim that off. My strip is doubled over, so with this cut I'm getting 2, and I need a total of 4, so I'm going to cut 1 more. All right, now I'm going to set those aside, and I'm going to set them aside in the order that I have cut, so that after I've cut all of the goldenrod pieces, I'm then going to go and distribute all of those pieces to their proper baggies for the unit or block that they are going to make. So I'm going to go ahead and check that off. Next, I'm going to subcut two 2.5 by 5.5 inch rectangles. So I'm already at 5.5 inches. So I just need to cut a 2.5 inch piece off here. And again, because my strip is doubled over, I actually have two pieces there. So I have those two rectangles. Then I'm going to subcut these into a total of 4 2.5 inch squares. My 4 2.5 inch squares, I will set those aside. Done that. Then I'm going to take the remainder of this 5.5 inch strip, and I'm going to trim it to 1.5 inches and then subcut into 16 1.5 inch squares. So of course I can get a couple of 1.5 inch strips off of this. Let me start with 2. I have 2 folded strips. That's 4 layers of fabric. And that gives me 16 1.5 inch squares. Right. These are right now just leftover pieces. I'll set those aside. And now I'm going to cut 4 3.5 inch strips. I'm going to stack all of my strips together. You can just stack 2 strips if you wish, and then cut them separately. That, whatever you feel comfortable with. I feel confident that I can cut through the 8 layers of fabric. Then I'm going to subcut into a total of 20 3.5 by 6.5. So first I'm going to square up the edge here, take off the selvage. I'm going to cut 6.5 inches. And I have a 6.5 inch ruler that I'm going to use. Makes it a little bit easier than trying to wield the large one. So that is 8, 16, and I just need 4 more. So I'm just going to take 2 strips. Again, they're folded in half, so I have 4 layers here, and I will cut those last 4. And now I have my 20 rectangles. Last up is to cut 4 3.5 inch squares. And I can get those right off of this stack. And again, because I had 2 strips doubled over, I have a total of 4 3.5 inch squares. Now, before we go any further in cutting the next color, which happens to be dark green, we're going to go ahead and distribute these pieces that have been cut from the goldenrod. So I'm just going to reference the fabric distribution chart, and that tells me exactly where each of these pieces go. Also included in the downloadable guide are these sheets that are labels for the blocks and for the other units that are part of this quilt. So I'm going to cut these apart, get my baggies, and we'll start distributing these fabrics. I'm just laying out the various tags here. The goldenrod doesn't go with all of the pieces. So we have block tags, blocks 1 through 6. We have flying geese tags, flying geese 1 through 6. We have a corner 9 patch, an edge 9 patch, and a mini 9 patch, as well as an inner border and a sashing. So I know that the goldenrod is not part of those. So let's take a look at where our goldenrod goes. Our 4 5.5 inch squares go with block 6. So I'm going to go ahead and just place those in a baggie. And then I can keep adding to the baggie as I cut more pieces of the other colors. 8 of the 3.5 by 6.5 rectangles go to flying geese 3. 8 are going to go to flying geese 6. And 4 of them go into block number 1. And I'm just going to use the small bag for now. I may have to get a larger bag, but I don't have one handy. All right, the 4 3.5-inch squares go with block 3. Oops, those are the 2.5-inch squares. We want the 3.5-inch squares. Now the 2.5-inch squares go with the corner 9 patch. And those little 1.5-inch squares, they're part of block number 4. I'm just going to go ahead and set all my block baggies aside while I get ready to cut the next fabric. Next up for cutting is what I'm calling dark green. So it has this murky, dark color with some lighter greens on top, but I'm calling it dark green. This is the fabric that will be some sashing, 3.5-inch wide. So you want to make sure that whichever fabric you pick for that, you like what it looks like as a long 3.5-inch strip. And I'm going to square up the edge of the fabric, and then I am going to cut 9 3.5-inch strips. I will not be stacking all of them on top of each other. I have a limit. All right, I have stacked 3 strips in each pile, so I have a total of 9. And then I'm going to trim up the selvage edge, and I'm going to cut a total of 24 3.5 by 9.5-inch rectangles. So with 3 strips doubled over, that's 6. That gives me 12. Do the same for this stack. All right, I have my 24 rectangles. And then with these last strips, I'm going to cut a total of 32 3.5-inch squares. So again, there's 6 layers of fabric. And then I just need 2 more. So I'm just going to take one folded over strip and cut out that last pair of squares. All right, these are leftover bits. I have my sashing and I have my squares. So let's see where they go. And again, I'm just going to reference the fabric distribution chart. So all 24 rectangles go for sashing. So I'm going to put those aside. And that is all of the sashing. And then we have 16 that are going to go with flying geese number 1 and 16 with flying geese number 6. So we have 12 there. So 4 more and 4 more. We don't have anything with flying geese. This is our first color for that, but flying geese number 6 goes with goldenrod. So we'll just add these squares right in that bag. And that actually completes our flying geese number 6 bag. It only has 2 fabrics. So we can seal that up and set that aside, and I'll get a baggie for this one. We're now ready for our next color, which I am calling medium dark green. And this has quite a number of cuts, and we're going to be starting with 2 4-inch strips. So first up is to cut a total of 12 4-inch squares. So I have stacked my 2 doubled over strips, so there's 4 layers of fabric. So each cut of that produces 4 squares. So I'll make 3 cuts total. That will give me my 12. Set those aside. Don't forget to check off as you go so you don't get lost. Now I'm going to take the remaining strips here, remaining parts of the strips, and trim them down to 3.5 inches wide. And then I am going to subcut them into 3.5-inch squares. So we have 8, and if we open these up, we'll be able to get a couple more. All right, so I was able to get 10. My cutting instructions say I should get 9, so great that I got 10. Your cutting may vary. You might only end up getting 8, and that's fine, because now we're going to go ahead and cut some 3.5-inch strips, 3 of them to be exact, and we'll be cutting some rectangles and then some more squares. Ultimately, we need to end up with 16 of the 3.5-inch squares. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing by stacking my strips on top of each other. I have 3 double folded strips, so that's 6 layers. I want 12 3.5 by 6.5-inch rectangles. So with one cut, I will get 6. One more cut will give me my 12. Check those off. If you're not comfortable stacking multiple layers of your strips, that is fine. Just keep track of how many you are cutting, and you will be just fine. It now says to cut the remaining strip into 7 3.5-inch squares so that I have 16 total. Because I got 10, I really only need 6. So, just going to cut one stack here. All right, that gives me my 16. Check that off. Now we are going to be cutting 2 3.25-inch strips. Because some of these measurements are so close to each other, that's why it's important you go in order on the cutting list and check off as you go. You know, if you're interrupted partway through, you might not remember where it is that you left off. So I'm always going to double check too. I went 3.25, and I need a total of 2 strips. From these, I am going to subcut into 16 3.25-inch squares. So I have 2 strips, double layered, that's 4 layers of fabric. So I will be getting 4 squares with each cut. And again, these are 3.25. And we needed 16 total. We're getting 4 with each cut. So we need 4 little stacks here. All right, those are my 16 3.25. I'm stacking those a little different than the 3.5 so that hopefully I remember which stack is which. All right, with the remaining part of the strip, we're going to trim this down to 2 3/4 inches wide. Subcut that into 12 2 3/4-inch squares. So that will be 3 cuts. Let's see if we can get all these out of here. All right, whew, just made it. We are going to cut a 2 3/4-inch strip. Just one, because we only need a few squares off of this. If you weren't able to get the 12 off of the previous cut, the strip that we trimmed down from 3.25 to 2 3/4, you'll be able to get whatever else you need from here. All right, and from this we only need 4. So you can see there's plenty left if you needed to cut more. Next, 2 strips that we need to cut, because they are only 1.5 inches wide. And by cutting these full length strips, I'm going to be able to get all the pieces that I need out of them. All right, I'm going to be cutting a total of 48, and I have 4 layers of fabric. So that will be 12 little cuts after I even off the selvages there. All right, 1.5. There's our 12 little piles of 4. That gives me my 48. So now I'm getting my fabric distribution chart, and I'm looking at the medium green. So my 12 4-inch squares are going to go to block 2. Then 4 of our 3.5 by 6.5-inch rectangles, they're going to go into block 1. Set that aside. And then our other 8 go into flying geese number 5. Next up, we have the 3.5-inch squares, and there should be 16 of these. Double check. Yep, 3.5. Yep, 16. And they are going into flying geese number 2. Then we have our 16 3.25-inch squares. We get 4 stacks of 4. And those are going into block 5. Then we have 16 of our 2 3/4 inch squares. These are also part of block 5. And then all 48 of our tiny little 1.5 inch squares are part of the mini 9 patch. All right, that takes care of medium dark green. Let's set our block pieces aside and get ready to cut the navy. All right, our first cut on this is to cut 2 6.5 inch strips. So because this ruler isn't wide enough, I am going to take another ruler and add that 1/2 inch. Making sure it's all lined up. And this will give me my 6.5 inch strip. And I will need a total of 2 of these. From these 2 strips, I'm going to cut a total of 8 6.5 inch squares. And each cut is giving me 4 because I had 2 strips doubled over. So 2 cuts gives me the 8. I'm going to take the remaining piece here and cut a 3.5 inch wide strip. And then I'm going to cut this down into 3.5 inch squares. So I easily got 8 of those. I figured I'd get at least 7, so I'm just going to mark over here that I got 8 because we will be cutting some more so that I get 16 in total. All right, now we're cutting 2 5 inch strips. From these, I'm going to cut 16 5 inch squares. So 2 strips folded over, that gives me 4 layers of fabric. I need to make 4 squares coming off of this, and these are 5 inch. All right, those are my 16 5 inch squares. Now I'm going to cut a 3.5 inch strip so that I can cut some more 3.5 inch squares. Now, here I only have 2 layers of fabric, and I already had 8, so I only need 8 more. So that's 4 cuts of 3.5. All right, I'll set all those there. And you can see if you didn't get 8 out of trimming down that 6.5 inch strip, there is still fabric left that you could get some more out of. And the last strip is a single 2.5 inch strip, and from that we'll be getting 16 2.5 inch squares. All right, let's distribute the navy. So for the navy, the 8 6.5 inch squares are part of the inner border. So I'm going to set those aside with the sashing. We won't use those until we're actually putting the border together. And the sashing we'll use with a couple of the blocks. Next, we have our 16 5 inch squares, and these are going to go into block number 4. Then we have 16 3.5 inch squares. These are going into flying geese number 4. And our last bit, which are the 16 2.5 inch squares, are going into block number 6. All right, it's time to do what I'm calling the medium blue. And this is just another beautiful Hoffman batik, predominantly blue, a little bit of purple, a little bit of green, just gorgeous. And we're going to start off by making 1 6.5 inch strip. From this, I'm going to be cutting 8 3.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles. So it's already 6.5 inches wide. I just need it to be 3.5 inches. The next strip to cut is a 5.5 inch strip. And these are getting cut into 8 5.5 inch squares. All right, there's not enough left in this, but that's okay because we have this 6.5 inch strip that we're going to trim down to 5.5, and we have all 8 squares. Next up, we are going to cut 2 4 inch strips. From these strips, I'm going to cut 12 4 inch squares, and I have 4 layers of fabric, so that'll be 3 little piles here. All right, there's my 3 piles of 4 inch squares. Now I'm going to trim this remaining strip to 3.25 inches wide, and I'm going to cut this into 3.25 inch squares. So let's see how many I can get out of this strip. We get 1 more set. Oh, just. Now, depending on how you've cut, you may not be able to get that, but that's okay because we're going to cut another 3 1/4 inch strip. We'll be able to get whatever else we need out of that. Let's cut a 3 1/4 inch strip. And again, we only need 4 squares because I was able to get 12. If you were only able to get 8, for instance, then you would obviously need to cut 8 more. All right, all of those are cut. We have 16 total of the 3 1/4 inch squares. Now, we have this quite a bit of strip left, and that's fine because we're going to cut this down to 2 3/4 inches. And then we are going to subcut this into as many 2 3/4 inch squares as we can. All right, I was able to get 10, and I need a total of 16. So I just need 6 more. So I'm going to go ahead and cut 1 2 3/4 inch strips. All right, and I'm going to cut my remaining 6 from this strip. All right, that's all 16 from that. And then I just need 4 1 1/2 inch squares. So I'm just going to look through my scraps and see what I have. And let's take a look at where these pieces need to go. So this is the medium blue, and the 5 1/2 inch squares, all 8 of them, are going into block number 6. The 4 inch squares are going to go to block number 2, and there are 12 of those. The 16 3 1/4, that's these, and that's all of them, are going into block 5. Also in block 5 are the 16 2 3/4 inch squares. Then we have our 8 3 1/2 by 6 1/2 inch rectangles. These are going into block 4, which currently doesn't have a baggie, so put it with that. And also our 4 little 1 1/2 inch squares. All right, we are now at the teals. The teals are interchangeable in that it doesn't really matter which one is teal 1, teal 2, or teal 3. So I'm just going to call this one teal 1. And we're going to start, after we square off the edge, by cutting 6 3 1/2 inch strips. All right, from those 3 1/2 inch strips, I made 1 stack of 3 strips so that each cut gave me 6. And then the other stack has 2 strips where each cut is going to give me 4. We're going to cut a total of 52 3 1/2 inch squares. So I have 4 stacks of 12, that's 48, plus 4 more. That gives me the 52 that I need. If you're unable to get that many out of 5 strips, you do have enough fabric to cut a 6th strip to get any remaining squares that you might need. I then cut 2 2 1/2 inch strips, and I'm going to subcut these into 32 2 1/2 inch squares. All right, there we have our 32 2 1/2 inch squares. Next up, we take the 4 1 1/2 inch strips that we cut. These are going to cut differently than our last little set of 1 1/2 inch squares. This time we are cutting them into 32 1 1/2 by 5 1/2 inch rectangles. So I have 4, that's 8 layers of fabric. And again, if you're not comfortable cutting through that many layers, just do 2 and 2. I'm going to bring over all of my 3 1/2 inch squares, but they're not all going into one place. So 4 of them are going to go with block number 1. 32 of them are going with block number 3. These 16 are going into flying geese number 3. The 32 2 1/2 inch squares are going to the edge 9 patch. And all 32 of our rectangles here are going into block number 4. All right, we are now ready for teal number 2. And we are going to start off with cutting 1 4 1/2 inch strip from this 4.5-inch strip, we're going to cut 4 4.5-inch squares. We're going to trim the remaining part of the strip down to 4 inches. And then this is going to be subcut into 4-inch squares. Let's see how many we can get out of this. Oh, we got 6. Very good. Don't forget to check off as you go. Instead of 5, I got 6, so I'm just going to mark that there because we're going to cut some more 4-inch strips and then cut more 4-inch squares until we have a total of 32. So next up is to cut 3 4-inch strips. Stacked all 3 strips together, so I have 6 layers of fabric, and I am cutting 4-inch squares until I have a total of 32. That gives me 32 4-inch squares. Now we're going to cut 3 3.5-inch strips. I base the number of pieces you can get out of a strip based on 40 inches of usable width of fabric. Most quilting fabric, and certainly batiks, are actually a little bit longer than that. This just gives you a little bit more leadway in case you need to square up the fabric or if you have a slight miscut. And that is why, on occasion, we get more pieces out of, especially a trimmed down strip, than what it may say in the instructions. So it's not that you're doing it wrong. It just may be that you're able to get out a little bit more fabric. Likewise, I have also allowed so that if you don't get as many out of the strip, there should still be enough fabric from your yardage to get any remaining pieces that you need. All right, I've stacked all 3 3.5-inch strips together, and I'm going to cut these into 8 3.5 by 6.5-inch rectangles. So I'm going to use my 6.5-inch wide ruler here. Now this is going to give me 6 right off the bat. And then I'm just going to take one of these strips because I only need 2 more. And remember, my strips are doubled. So from 3 strips, I got 6. And then from the 1 strip, I'm getting 2 more. And now I have a total of 8 of those rectangles. So I can cross those off. And then I need to get 16 3.5-inch squares out of the remaining parts of these strips. So I'm just going to keep cutting the single strip that I had removed from the group here. And got my 3.5-inch squares. Here's 4. I need 12 more. So now I have 2 strips here. So each cut's going to give me 4. That's 12. 13, 14, 15, 16. All right. That is all of that. And then our last bit is to cut 1 2.5-inch strip. And from that, we're going to get 16 2.5-inch squares. I've just doubled over my single strip here so that I can make less cuts and get more fabric. So out of each cut, I'll get 4. I just need 4 little piles of squares. All right, that is all the cutting for teal number 2. Let's distribute those fabrics. The 4 4.5-inch squares are going to block number 6. The 32 4-inch squares are going in block number 2. The 8 rectangles, flying geese, number 4. The 16 3.5-inch squares go in flying geese number 5. And the 16 2.5-inch squares are for the corner 9 patch. And now we have this beautiful Hoffman sunflower fabric. I love this fabric. And we're going to start by cutting 1 5.5-inch strip. I'm going to subcut this into 4 5.5-inch squares. I'm going to set aside the remainder of that strip and go ahead and cut the next section, which is 3 3.25-inch strips. from these strips, I'm going to cut a total of 32 3¼ inch squares, and I have 3 strips, so it's 6 layers of fabric. Okay, that gives me 30. I need a total of 32, so I'm just going to take one of these strips. Again, it's still doubled, so one cut will give me the last 2 that I need. From the 2 strips that are remaining and have any fabric really left in them, I am going to trim this down to 3 inches wide, and I need to get 4 3-inch squares out of this, which I will. And then we're going to just cut 1 3-inch strip so we can cut 12 3-inch squares from that. We're going to need a total of 16. We already have 4, so we just need 12 more. Next up is to cut 2 2 3/4-inch strips. We need a total of 16 of these 2 3/4-inch squares. You can get 14 out of a strip, probably even a 15th. But I have this leftover bit from the 3-inch strip, so I'm just going to trim it down, and I can get the last 2 out of that. Now we need 1 2½-inch strip, which will be cut into 16 2½-inch squares. We can get 16 out of a 2½-inch strip. And the last cut is 2 1½-inch strips, which are going to be cut down into 48 1½-inch squares. I know, those are some tiny little squares. And I'm also going to fold those over so I don't have to make so many cuts. And again, I'm trimming off the barest minimum of the folds and the selvage. And each cut is going to give me 8, I believe. Perfect. And less cuts. All right, let's distribute these guys. The 4 5½-inch squares are going with block number 6. The 3 1/4-inch squares, which there are 32, and I'm going to double check that those are the 3 1/4, and they are, you see. They are going into block 5. 16 of the 3-inch squares, which will be all of those, and again, I'm double checking that this is the 3-inch because we have 3-inch, 2 3/4, 2 1/2. They're all very similar, so make sure that you've got the right ones, and they all have 16 in them. And this is going into block 6. And back to block 5, that's where our 2 3/4-inch squares are going. And again, I'm just double checking. Yep, 2 3/4. And while I have block 5 out, also the 2 1/2-inch squares are going in there. And those last little 1 1/2-inch squares, all 48 of them, are going into the mini 9-patch. And we are now down to our next to the last fabric, the pale green. Another beautiful Hoffman batik. And we're going to start off by cutting 3 3½-inch wide strips. All right, I'm stacking those together. And I'm going to start by cutting a total of 12 3½-inch squares. So I have 3 strips folded over. That's 6 layers of fabric. Right, that is all of those. And then I need 32 2-inch by 3½-inch. So my strip is already 3½. I'm going to cut off 2-inch rectangles. And again, I need a total of 32. Right, that is 30. So I'm just going to remove one of the strips so I can cut the last 2 that I need. And now I'm going to cut 3 2½-inch strips. From these 3 2½-inch strips, I'm going to cut a total of 48 2½-inch squares. Last up is to cut 3 1½-inch strips. Stacking these together, and we are going to cut a total of 16 1½ by 5-inch rectangles. So that is 12, and I just need 4 more. So I'm going to take 2 of the strips to cut the remaining rectangles. And then I need 16 1.5-inch squares. So let's see where these fabrics are going to go. The 12 3.5-inch squares go in block number 1. And this will actually finish off block 1. The 32 2-inch by 3.5-inch rectangles go into block number 3. This also finishes off the fabrics for those blocks. Of the 48 2.5-inch squares, 16 of them are going to go into the corner 9 patch. So I have 12. And grab 4 more. That is 16. These are for the corner 9 patch. That will finish off all that we need for those. The remaining 32 2.5-inch squares are going to the edge 9 patch, which still need a bag and still have 1 more fabric to go. And the 1.5 by 5-inch rectangles and the 1.5-inch squares are both going into block number 4. All right, we are down to our last fabric, and this is what I'm calling white fabric, the very lightest of the fabrics in the quilt. And we're going to start by cutting a 6.5-inch strip. This is getting trimmed down to 8 3.5 by 6.5-inch rectangles. And we're going to cut 1 4-inch strip. We're going to subcut the strip into 8 4-inch squares. Then we're going to trim the remainder of this strip to 3 inches wide and cut 3-inch squares from that. It says I can get 3, and I could get a third one out of that, but I'm going to set that aside, and if I need it for the third, I will, because we're now going to cut a 3-inch strip to get more 3-inch squares out of. We need a total of 16. That is 12. This will make 14, plus the other 2 gives me the 16. Now, if you didn't have enough, depending on your fabric, you could certainly use that remnant from before, open it up, and easily get another 3-inch square out of that. Now we have left is cutting 2 2 3/4-inch strips. We're going to get 16 2 3/4-inch squares, and we will still have some strip left, which we'll be trimming down. Right from the remaining bits of this 2 3/4-inch strip, we're going to trim it down to 2.5-inch. And from this, we are going to cut into 8 2.5-inch squares. And then we need 12 1.5-inch squares. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this strip down, see how many I can get out of this. And we're going to cut these into 1.5-inch squares. That's why it's always good to measure twice, cut once. Perfect. All right, let's distribute the last fabrics. The 4-inch squares are going into block number 2. The rectangles go into Flying Geese number 2, which has a small baggie. So we'll just put them in this way. The 16 3-inch squares, again, I'm going to double check. Yep, 3 inches. Those are going into block number 6. The 16 2 3/4-inch squares are going into block number 5. The 8 2.5-inch squares are the edge 9 patch, which don't have a baggie yet. But that's all of those squares. And then these last little ones are for the mini 9 patches, also in need of a bag. All right, if you've made it all the way to the end, from here on out, the videos will be shorter because we'll be starting to put together the blocks. On Tuesday, January 13th, I will be releasing the first block. It's exciting, it's easy, and it's a good way to get started. Until then, why not check out this?